Users and groups. Hey everyone, Ben Finkel here, and in this nugget, we're going to look at some of the administrative features for users and security groups inside of Office 365. We'll both take a look inside of the admin dashboard, the admin panel, as well as drop down to our command line to use some PowerShell commandlets. It's really easy to manage users and groups from the Office portal, so I wanted to launch right into it and show you how you can do that. You should bring up portal.office.com, and I'm going to launch the admin portal from the menu in the upper left. You should be pretty familiar with this by now. We spend most of our time inside of this course in the admin panel here. And of course, users are managed right here on the left under the users pull down. If you drop this down, select active users, you can see all the users who are currently active in your system. We went through this a little bit during my nugget on tenancy, but if you want to add a user, you simply click add user. You fill in the detailed information, first name, last name. You notice the asterisks. The only two required fields are display name and username. So I can make this guy Joe User. His display name will be Joe User. His username will be Joe User at. I can choose from my different domain names here. We'll make it cbtnrocks.com. Why not? Down below, there's some different information. We learned a little bit about roles inside of our administrative roles. So if you want to make this user a member of one of the admin roles, you can do that right here when you create them. Click Add, and that adds your user to the system. Users can also be deleted very easily from the interface as well. You just come into the user, select them, and click the delete user button, and away they go. Now, one thing to notice is that the super user, the original global admin user, does not have a delete button. You cannot delete this user unless there's another global administrator to back them up. When you do delete a user, another important thing to notice is, hey, that's relatively easy to do. I just click the delete button, confirm it, and away that user goes. If you do that on accident, you might think, oh man, where'd my user go? I got to recreate it. You don't. Look over here on the left. You've got deleted users. When you delete a user out of Office 365, regardless of how you deleted them, through PowerShell commands, through the interface here, it's actually called a soft delete. And a soft delete drops the user into this deleted users panel where they sit for 30 days. So users are perfectly and easily recoverable for 30 days if you delete them. You simply come here to the deleted users, click restore, and that user's coming right back. It'll be an active user once again right here in the active panel. You can see right now how quickly that happens. Another great way to get users into the system is with bulk imports. So adding users one at a time through the interface can take a while. It can be frustrating, particularly if you have a lot of users to add. But if you look here under the Active Users tab, when we pull down the More option, we have Import Multiple Users. And that allows us to import users from a CSV file. If you're not familiar with CSV, it's very simple. That stands for comma separated values. And CSV, I'm going to open one in Notepad here, is just a text file that has all of the values separated by commas. This will look vaguely familiar. So in a CSV file, you've got up here in the very first row, you have the titles of each column, and then each row has a different object in it. So here's user 1, user 2, and user 3 that I've got inside of this sample CSV file. If you want to see a sample of a CSV file, you can download it right here. This one with just the headers, just that first row, or here's one with actually some sample user information. By the way, another neat tip for working with CSVs, if you find Notepad a little bit clumsy, Excel is a great way to work on a CSV file. When you edit a CSV file in Excel, it separates everything out into these cells, and then you can save it as a CSV file, and it saves it with all of the appropriate commas separating the values for you. So Excel is a really nice, easy way to work with these files. When you want to import the file, simply browse to it with the Browse button here. And then you can click the Verify button, and it will make sure that your file looks good. I just clicked Verify on mine, and it says, yeah, it does look good. You know what? I just want to show you this in action. Let's make a small change. I'm going to come here, and I'm going to change this user. So let's say I forgot to put the domain name on user 1. Do I want to save it as CSV? Yes, I do. We'll come back to this interface. We will browse and reload it again. Click Verify. Now it says there's some problems with the files, and it gives me a log file that I can download and view to see what the problem was. And here it says row number 1 had an error, invalid domain name used in the username. So it can very easily identify any problems in your CSV file for you. Also notice that I left a lot of values blank. You only really have to fill in the required values, so don't be afraid that you need to fill out every column for every user that you want to import. So that's all you need to do to import users in bulk, verify it. While you're importing it, you can set up some different options for these users, whether sign-ins are allowed or whether they're blocked. You can assign a license right here, any available licenses that you have. You can assign to these users, so I can turn on Office Enterprise E3. I've got 4 licenses available, so it is going to assign all of them. Or I could create the users without a license if you want. Click Next. The last thing it's going to do is import these users into my system, and when it's done, I should see them inside of my active users here. Close this. Refresh the page. Boom, 3 users, Jill, Jane, and Joe Q user, all added to my system. One last thing I want to show you how to do is how to set up what's called multi-factor authentication, or MFA. If you're not familiar with multi-factor authentication is where you have an extra device or an extra step called a factor when authenticating a user. So a user doesn't only sign in with their username and password, but maybe they also get a text message on their phone and they've got to input a code. So that helps with security. If you want to really have good, sound, solid security, you should implement multi-factor authentication. Microsoft, in fact, highly recommends it. When you choose that option from the menu, it's going to launch into the Azure portal. This is all set up as part of Azure Active Directory. I can choose which users are going to have multi-factor authentication associated with them. So let's say Joe Q user. And I simply click Enable multi-factor authentication, and it's going to turn it on. And now he is enabled, or MFA is enabled for that user. There's a second step to enabling multi-factor authentication, and that's here under Service Settings. I have to choose what factors the users can potentially use for their secondary factor. And here you see the 4 different options they can get: a call to their phone, so they can have the computer system actually call them and read them off a code that they key in. They can get a text message, an SMS message on their phone. A notification through a mobile app. Office 365 has a mobile app that the user can download on their device, Android or iPhone, and that will get them a notification. They click the button or they get the code from that application and input that in during their login process, and same thing with verification code. So you have these different options. You enable them and configure them here. Once you're done, you click Save. Multi-factor authentication now enabled for these users. Finally, let's look at doing a little bit of this work inside of PowerShell. Of course, this is Microsoft. They love PowerShell, and they're going to ask you about PowerShell on the exam. So I've got my PowerShell command window up here, and I've already connected to my MSOL service. If you don't know what I'm talking about, check out the nugget on PowerShell, setting up PowerShell for Office 365 in this course. Now, having done this, I can remove or delete users very easily from PowerShell with the remove-msol user command. I simply pass in the user principal name. We'll go with joeuser@cbtnrocks.com. It's going to ask me to confirm. I will say yes, and that user is now deleted from the system. But remember, they're only soft deleted. They still exist inside of that deleted users. I could look at that in the interface if I wanted to, or I could call get-msol user and pass in the return deleted users parameter like I do right here, and there it is. He's in the deleted users. So that's how I can look at the deleted users from PowerShell. And I can do even more than that. If I pipe this out, let's say to format table, we'll call property user principal name and object ID. Well, I can see the object ID for this user, and I can do something very cool with that. I'm going to highlight that, get it on the clipboard. If I can highlight it right here. From here, I can actually call a restore MSOL user, and that will restore them from the deleted users list. I pass in the object ID parameter. I'll paste in that user's object ID, and they are now restored back to an active user. So if I were to call the return deleted users again, I would see nothing returned because there are no more deleted users. I restored them back to an active user. Now, doing some of the more advanced tasks like bulk importing a CSV file or updating with multi-factor authentication takes a little bit more work. There are not easy command lists set up to do that. If you want to import a bulk CSV file inside of PowerShell, what you want to do is you want to call this import-csv command. Pass in /users.csv, and I'm going to pass it right into this $user object. Having done that, I'm going to pipe that out to format as a table here. You can see I got my 3 users into this object, this $user object. I could then, for each through, I can iterate through the user object, passing it into, or passing its parameters, passing the property of each object into the set-msol user command that we covered that in another nugget that creates a user inside of the system. And that might look something like this. So you can see here I'm iterating with for each dash object through that object, and it will add those into the system. I can't actually operate this or execute this because these users are already in the system. I don't want to try to double them up. But hopefully you get the idea. If you want to use multi-factor authentication, you're going to have to create an auth object like this. You can see here it's a type of Microsoft.online.administration.strong authentication requirement. Having done that, you can set the auth.state to equal enabled. And now that the auth.state is set to enabled, I can pass this auth object into set-msol user. So using the -strong authentication requirements parameter. I would pass in the auth object, and that user would be updated with whatever requirements I filled out in the object that I created. In this case, I set the auth.state to enabled. Now, the last thing to cover here is the very simple concept of security groups. Right underneath the users option here on the dashboard is the groups option. And when we create a group, all we're doing is creating a collection of users in the system. I click the add group button right here, give it a type, give it a name that's required. We'll call this my group. I can give it a group ID, so it'll actually have an email address for the group, and that way I could email the group, and everyone inside of the group, every member of the group, will get the email. Having done this, I also need to select an owner of the group. I'll make Benjamin Finkel the owner of the group. Click Add, and now the group has been created. And you want to create security groups primarily for the purpose of assigning security rights. We talked about this, well, a little bit like in our Azure rights management, setting up administrators for that, for instance. You would want to grant the permissions to be an administrator of Azure rights management, not to individual users, but to the group. And that way, people can be added as members of the group, and they will inherit those rights, or they can be removed from that group, and they will lose those rights. It's a much better, much cleaner way to manage rights inside of the system. So that's all we need to do. Now there's my group, and if I want, I can come down here and edit my members, and I can add as many members as I would like. Simply click the Add Members button up here, and then we'll make Joe Q User a member of this group. Click Save, and now this has two members in it, the original owner, Ben Finkel, and Joe Q User. You can see them listed right here. The PowerShell commands for working with these groups are really easy as well. Get-msol group is going to return all of the groups inside of my system. You can see the one that was already there, ADRM admins, as well as my group that I just created. If I copy this object ID onto the clipboard, I can pass it into the get-msol group member. And here I'll say object ID, group object ID rather. Pass that in, and that's going to list out all of the members of that particular group. So now I can see, oh yeah, I've got those two users in it. Adding members to the group with PowerShell ought to be really straightforward. Use the add msol group member commandlet. But you do have to work with object IDs, both the group object ID as well as the user object ID in order for that to happen in this commandlet. And there's another challenge. Watch what happens when I try to run this. I get an error back. It says, you cannot update mail-enabled groups using this commandlet. Use Exchange Online to perform this operation. So because this is all tied in with Exchange Online, because you can mail people inside of the group via Office 365, this commandlet is not going to work. So at first it may jump out at you as one that you can use. You can't. And if it comes up on the test, remember that you have to use Exchange Online to add members. You can't do it with PowerShell. So that concludes this nugget on users and groups. Just to recap, we looked at the portal, the admin portal at portal.office.com, and saw how we could create and remove users and how they got soft deleted when we deleted them so that they could be restored if we needed them to. We also looked at the PowerShell commands to perform those same operations, including how to restore a user with the restore commandlet. We finished by talking about security groups and how they're just collections of user accounts that can be used primarily for setting up security, but also for email lists. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.